If you spend any time in politics right now, you hear two very different stories about the economy. One is the abundance story. Build more housing, more energy, more infrastructure, let more people in, and we can all be better off. That's the optimistic, grow the pie vision that we here at The Argument believe in. The other is the zero-sum story. If they gain, you lose. If immigrants come, you get pushed out. If new people move into Bushwick, they are taking something away from existing residents. If some group gets attention or resources, it's coming out of your hide. That's not just a slogan for a lot of people, it feels like common sense. In this episode, we're talking about that zero-sum worldview, where it comes from, when it's actually rational, and how much it explains about our so-called weird politics. Economists and political scientists call it zero-sum thinking, the belief that for one group to get ahead, another group has to fall behind. You can apply it to all kinds of conflicts: rich versus poor, black versus white, citizens versus immigrants, America versus the rest of the world. You see it in fights about housing, immigration, trade, college admissions, even who gets attention from politicians. And it's easy to treat zero-sum as an insult. Like you're small-minded, or you don't understand economics, you haven't read enough blog posts about marginal productivity. But the history of this country makes it very easy to see the world that way. If you grew up in an era of stagnant wages, if your family's story includes enslavement or internment or exploitation, if your parents lived through decades where the pie really did feel fixed or rigged, it's not obviously irrational to assume that politics is a scramble over a limited good. There's actually a long intellectual tradition behind that idea. In the 1960s, anthropologist George Foster wrote about what he called the image of limited good in small, poor communities. The sense that there's only so much land, honor, status to go around, so every gain by your neighbor must be coming at your expense. That logic isn't crazy if you live in a world without much growth or technology or mobility. What Sahil Chinoy and his co-authors do in their new paper is take that intuition and ask, how much of American politics today still runs on that image of limited good? And where do those beliefs actually come from? They fielded a massive survey of more than 20,000 Americans and built a measure of how zero-sum or positive-sum people are across different domains: race, immigration, trade, and class. Then they linked those beliefs to people's families' histories and to the places that their parents and grandparents lived. Did your parents experience upward mobility or stagnation? Did they immigrate here? Were they subject to slavery or other forms of coercion? Did they grow up in an era of broad-based growth, or in decades where the bottom half of the country basically stopped moving? Out of that, they get a picture that's both sobering and clarifying. Zero-sum thinking isn't just a left-right thing. There are big splits within both parties. It helps explain why some Democrats are very pro-redistribution but skeptical of immigration, and why some Republicans are open to safety net programs. It shows up as a generational story. Young people who've lived through slower growth look more zero-sum than older Americans who came of age in the long post-war boom. And it shows how the deepest parts of American history, enslavement, forced labor, internment, still shape how some communities view economic and political conflict today. My name is Jerusalem Demsas. I'm the founder and editor of The Argument, a magazine dedicated to bringing everyone from socialists to conservatives together in conversation over the most important issues of the day. For me, this matters because so many of the projects I care about, immigration, housing, energy, building more stuff, depend on people believing that there are positive-sum deals to be had, that we are not condemned to fight forever over a fixed pie. But if a big share of the electorate has good reasons, rooted in their own lives and in their family's experience, to see the world as zero-sum, you can't just dunk on them with a supply and demand graph. You have to understand where that worldview comes from and how it intersects with our institutions and our parties. So today, we're going to unpack all of that. What zero-sum thinking actually is, how Sahil measures it, why history and family stories matter so much, and what all of this means for anyone trying to build a durable, pro-immigration, pro-growth, pro-building coalition in the United States. Here's my conversation with Sahil Chinoy. For an ad-free version of this episode, you can become a subscriber at theargumentmag.com. Sahil, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we're here to talk about why people have bad opinions, which is the least
Not preppy
charitable
for
way
that.
of explaining a big part of the conversation we're having today. But I mean, to me, think we're in this moment right now when there's this big discourse happening, particularly on the left, around abundance and how to inculcate positive sum economic ideas in at least the policy space, if not the political space. And it got me thinking a lot about your research, which is about like the prevalence of zero-sum thinking and why it is that people have zero-sum opinions. But first I want to just define what that is. Like, what does it mean to have a zero-sum belief?
Yeah, so zero-sum worldview, as we define it in the paper, is the idea that in transactions or interactions for one group to gain, another group has to necessarily lose.
Mm-hmm.
And the paper is studying this as a generalized mindset, a worldview that applies to all kinds of different interactions across different domains. You can think of zero-sum more narrowly defined in particular areas like wealth or immigration, but yeah, broadly a zero-sum worldview is the idea that when one group gains, another group has to lose.
And where do these ideas come from?
That is a big question. And so the paper that we've written argues that these attitudes are shaped by really important historical forces and cultural forces. So things like experiences of economic mobility, experiences of immigration, both like personal and ancestral and family experiences of immigration, as well as community experiences of having immigrants in your area. It's shaped by important historical forces like slavery, obviously a huge part of American history. And so they're kind of deep-rooted in that way. That's the paper that we've written. There are other people who have different ideas about where it comes from.
Yeah, what are the debates? Like, what's kind of like the
I don't know that there are debates necessarily, but I think that there are different, I guess, approaches to studying zero-sum thinking. So like I mentioned, ours is taking this like cultural and to some extent economic viewpoint on it, economic forces operating in this like long time horizon across multiple generations.
Yeah.
There are other approaches that study zero-sum thinking more as I suppose like a static psychological attribute, something about the way you think and study the things that's correlated with.
In like a personality sense.
Sort of a personality sense, yeah. I think that's a fair way of thinking about it. And then there are other papers, again, more in the econ literature that study zero-sum thinking, kind of like emerging strategically as sort of a rational response to a particular situation, especially a particular political situation. So, yeah, I think those are, broadly how I think about the various like types of ways people have studied this.
So, I mean, I think that before we get into kind of like, I mean, you laid out so many different fun pathways that we're going to go down, but one thing I want to get at, because I think that like, as I kind of previewed in how I open things, like when you hear zero-sum, you think of it as pejorative, like, oh, someone has a zero-sum mindset about something, right? Like it's not like a positive, usual characterization of someone or how they're thinking. But one thing I like about your paper is it takes very seriously that maybe there are good reasons or not at least irrational reasons for someone to arrive at zero-sum beliefs. And so, the implications of this for someone like me, where I am really concerned with how do you create like a durable pro-immigration constituency in the United States, political constituency in the United States, and someone who wants to see a lot more housing built, a lot more energy built, like requires a lot of like positive sum views. But I want to take seriously the idea that like perhaps it's not irrational or even ridiculous to be thinking about the world, whether it's housing, whether it's immigration, whether it's other issues, in a zero-sum mindset. So what is the steel man for someone being zero-sum about a variety of issues?
Meaning, like, what's the best case?
What's the best case? Yeah.
I think our paper, again, to your point, is taking very seriously the idea that when people think a particular way, there's probably a reason, and we want to try and figure out what that reason is exactly. And I think the answer I think that our paper points to is that there are experiences that feel more zero sum, and there are experiences that feel more and are more positive sum, and it matters not just your current experience in the moment of a particular situation, but it matters what you have gone through and what your family has gone through over multiple generations. And those attitudes that are shaped in response to situations that may have been positive sum or zero sum or negative sum in the past are sticky. And so they persist even in the current moment when the actual situations that you're applying that sort of worldview to might not actually be zero sum or might not actually be positive sum. To make it concrete, something like the experience of economic mobility. So there are situations where actually economic growth is kind of stagnant and the world does look kind of zero sum. And maybe if your parents grew up in that environment and they passed on their worldview to you, even though the world might not be zero sum today, you sort of that mindset
What
is
is
sticky.
like an economic zero sum situation? What does that look like?
I think the idea of like zero economic growth, right? Obviously, we're not usually in that literally that edge case, but times of low economic growth feel a lot more zero sum, where it feels like we're just kind of shuffling things around. We're redistributing a fixed amount of resources. We argue in the paper that another really important thing when looking at American history is enslavement, an economic interaction that is definitely not positive sum, zero sum. Some would argue negative sum, value destroying in some sense.
But
so
so in the situation of like slavery, it's like you are literally being enslaved for the purpose of providing value to other people. Like that is literally what is happening. And then if you extrapolate that to all work is you kind of being exploited in some sense. Obviously not as intense as slavery, but that's an easy way to see how those things. So you do find in your paper that people who have a familial history with, it was like if grandparents had like were enslaved or what was
ancestors generally, basically, a family history of enslavement. We take that pretty broadly. So Black Americans in the U.S., that's sort of, I think, what we had in mind when we first posed the question. But I think we expanded to think about coercion more broadly, Japanese internment, other experiences that are kind of, I think, salient for people thinking about their family history in the U.S. But certainly we find kind of a robust correlation between those kinds of experiences and more zero-sum thinking.
And how does that manifest? I mean, I want to talk through, because you did this massive survey of 20,000 Americans. How are you measuring that people are more zero-sum now?
Yeah, got it. So I guess let's rewind and maybe think about some of these core issues like you mentioned, where when we started the study, we just had to figure out like how are we actually going to measure the thing that we're interested in. You can think of a couple of different ways to measure zero-sum thinking. You can ask people, do you think in general when one group gains, another group has to lose? It's a pretty generalized way of posing the question. You can ask it in perhaps more metaphorical terms. Do you think life is like a tennis game? When one person wins the tennis game, another person has to lose. Then you can think of it in domain-specific ways. So when one racial or ethnic group gains, does another racial or ethnic group have to lose necessarily? And that is appealing, I think, because people probably have more of a sense of what they actually think about that kind of more specific, domain-specific question. But it has the disadvantage of being domain-specific. And so, you can imagine that you actually have very different opinions about zero-sum interactions across different domains. And so our idea was to ask about domain-specific questions, but in four separate and distinct and important domains. And essentially take a weighted average, take an average across people's zero-sum thinking across those four different domains. It turns out that they are actually quite correlated. And so we think that there is kind of an underlying zero-sum worldview.
That's so interesting. So like somewhat that like, because I would have the expectation that like, well, maybe you're zero-sum when you think about, different racial groups. Like if white people are getting ahead, does that mean black people are necessarily falling behind? But that may not extrapolate to how you think about immigration. Like people often hold these conflicting views, or like, for instance, there are a lot of liberal people in major American cities who feel like, oh, well, newcomers, gentrifiers coming to my city, it's negative sum, but people coming into this country, I believe that that's positive sum. They have like a very progressive view on immigration. So you would imagine that those wouldn't correlate.
Yeah, and so certainly people's takes on zero-sum thinking across these different domains are correlated with their political views, their partisanship, their ideology, and kind of the way that you mentioned. Yet it is true that the underlying views are correlated across domains, and we can extract sort of a principal component or sort of one underlying factor across these four different domains, which I actually haven't explained yet. So we ask about racial groups or ethnic groups. We ask about citizenship, so Americans versus non-Americans. We ask about in matters of trade, when one country wins, does another country have to lose? And we ask about income groups. So when one income class in the U.S. gains, is it necessarily the case another class has to lose?
And yeah, I mean, one thing that I find really interesting about your work is I would have expected more of a partisanship gap than you find. You find a small one between Republicans are more likely to be positive sum than Democrats, but the big difference is within party.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through what you found there?
Yeah, I mean, that's precisely it, right?
Yeah.
Is that certainly there is a correlation between partisanship and your average levels of zero-sum thinking. We have a very large survey. We have 20,000 people, and so those differences are very statistically significant. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
That it seems like Democrats are more zero-sum than Republicans. But when you look at the variation within parties, that's where you see the bulk of the variation, right? So you can find positive sum or non-zero sum Democrats, you can find zero sum Republicans, you can actually find a decent number of them. And so that's what I mean when I say those distributions are actually quite overlapping.
And like, I guess this even brings us back to this question of like irrationality, because one thing you guys mentioned in your paper is there's a sense that like people who, people are always like, oh, why are there these lower income Republicans who are voting against their own self-interest? And what you theorize, like you can't, obviously there's no causal mechanism to prove in the paper, but like you theorize the idea that like, oh no, people who are more positive sum are not going to be as in favor of redistribution because if you believe that the pie is growing and that growth can accumulate to benefits for everyone, then you're less concerned with like, well, questions of how do we redistribute away from like the upper class or upper income groups. And I actually think that like, while that logic makes sense in redistribution, I was surprised by that in your paper. Were you surprised to find that zero-sum thinking correlates with support for redistribution?
I don't think I was necessarily surprised, again, because of the logic that you kind of just outlined. Mm-hmm. I guess it is surprising to find that there is this worldview or mindset that can shape policy preferences, important policy preferences, even within party.
Yeah.
So to the extent that you can find Republicans who are more pro-redistribution, maybe that is maybe the more surprising thing a little bit to me than the fact that correlates with zero-sum thinking. I mean, it's cool that it does, and I think that it makes sense once you sort of outline the logic.
Yeah.
It wasn't obvious that it would.
I guess it's just like for me, right? Like my thinking of positive sum economic relationships goes hand in hand with like my support for redistributive policy. And so to me, it's like, I mean, I don't think that that's like, oh, this is like the rational way to do it, but it's just like I hadn't really considered it. And so I was surprised by that. Were there other demographic findings in your paper that you were surprised by or things that you think are counterintuitive for most people?
I don't know about counterintuitive. So some of the patterns come through quite clearly. So the age gradient, again, it's hard for me to really say whether that's super counterintuitive or surprising. To me, I don't really remember what I expected ex ante. But we find a very strong age gradient, which maybe we'll talk about at some point, where younger people are much more zero sum than older people, and we trace that back to experiences of economic growth. That these different generations have experienced growing up.
And younger people in your paper are like millennials.
Younger people in our paper are, I always forget the generation. So, I mean, it goes all the way down to like 18-year-olds around, I guess, like the early 2020s, so 2022 or something like that.
So
they're I think, young.
They're like almost Gen Z.
I think so. I think they're coming upon, getting to Gen Z.
I don't believe in generations. They're younger than me, so I kind of just memory hold all of that.
Sure, yeah. I just always forget where they start and where they end.
But it's like young people today.
But it's young people today. It's young people today. Right. And so the real difference is, I think, in the older generations, people who were like over 50 at the time of our study, they tend to be much less zero sum than younger people. Again, we trace this back to, we look at sort of the correlation between the income growth among the bottom 50% and the bottom 90% in the U.S. during your childhood, so during the 20 years, the first 20 years of your life, these formative years. And we see whether that can sort of explain, in a predictive sense, zero-sum thinking, and indeed we find that it does. So the older people experienced much more growth, particularly among the bottom 50 or the bottom 90% when they were growing up. They tend to be more positive sum or less zero-sum. Younger people today haven't experienced that kind of growth, have experienced stagnation.
So I do find this counterintuitive.
Really?
And I think about that, I mean, not that I can't trace the logic of what you just said, but when I think about anti-growth politics in the United States, and I think about how much zero-sum thinking there is around, particularly from boomers who did benefit from a ton of post-World War II economic growth in their lifetimes, and then you think about who is the coalition opposing new housing or new immigration. I mean, this is where I struggle with like the rationality question around immigration, zero-sum attitudes that you see in your paper. Because like when we see who actually opposes immigration, it's not the people who are most exposed to like potential economic harm. It's not people who are like in competition with jobs with other 18-year-olds who are entry-level employees or entry-level workers, right, coming into the United States. It's older people who are often not actually living near immigrants, who are often the base of anti-immigration views, and like those are like, and so like it's possible to reconcile these things, but I did find it surprising.
Yeah, I mean that's fair. I think that the question I would have is whether older people who are anti-immigration are anti-immigration for the same reasons as younger people, in particular for this like zero-sum type of reason, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that it's older people saying immigrants are taking our jobs and who are justifying their anti-immigration sentiment on the basis of this kind of job competition. I don't know that rationale.
No, that's
is
a
the same
really,
for
really
everyone.
good point, because there's this question about like how much of your political attitudes or policy beliefs are shaped by zero-sum attitudes. What do you think? How important do you think zero-sum is for that?
In general, so just like generally how much
Maybe
is
we
your
can talk about it more and like specifically on these like issues of economic policy or redistribution, but what do you think?
I think it's a hard question to answer because so many things shape our policy views, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know that I have like a specific or a quantitative answer. I will say that the academic literature on this has for many, many decades studied all kinds of fundamental worldviews or attitudes or mindsets that can shape policy views. So things like whether you think that success comes because of effort or because of luck. Things like whether you think of morality in universal terms and you want to help people across the country just as much as you want to help people next door. Things like your perceptions of whether economic mobility is even possible. And all of these things matter in shaping a host of policy views. This one also seems to matter. And this one matters in particular after controlling for all of those other ones. And so that's what I mean when I think it's an important predictor. It's hard to say, can you sort of break your views and policy views generally into the percent explained by all of these categories, not in like a easy way, I think. Also because they interact. So I don't think it's a straightforward question to answer, but that would sort of be my
No,
answer.
I mean, I think it's super important because often you can have these silent conversations where you're like, oh, like, your family history of enslavement can help explain your views. And I think sometimes people can hear that as like way over-determined. Like, oh, well, now my views are entirely shaped by my past. But like, it can explain, I mean, it can be really important if it explains even 10% of the reason that your views are the way they are.
And in particular, it explains stuff within party, right? And I think I keep coming back to this point because I do think it's an important one, which is that so much of our policy views and our thinking generally is determined, or at least correlated with, predicted by partisanship in the current moment, that it is surprising to me that we can find things that don't break down so neatly along party lines.
So I want to turn to one thing that you already brought up, because I was really interested in how you were measuring this. So you ask people to rank their own economic status relative to their like other income groups, and they also ask them to rank that of their parents and grandparents, because you're doing this like survey at one time, and so you're not directly observing people's parents or grandparents' economic status. And so then you construct this measure of self-perceived intergenerational mobility. So like if you were asking me like, your grandfather, how did he, what was his economic situation? What was your dad's? And I'm saying like, well, my grandfather was in like some rural town in Eritrea. My dad was in Asmara, and now I'm in America. I'm like, yeah, tons of intergenerational mobility. You can construct that from those answers. But you use that to conclude that people who have that greater self-perceived intergenerational upward mobility is associated with less zero-sum thinking. And I guess I wonder here, right? Like, people's memories are like bad, and we find this all the time in surveys. And even what you said, like, I was like, oh, did you find anything surprising in this? And you're like, well, I have a hard time remembering exactly what I believed ex ante. And what I'm wondering is there a possibility that people who have zero-sum attitudes are more likely to report that their grandparents or parents were doing very well? Like, you see these memes all the time on the internet, right? Like, that are just like, wow, in like the 1990s, like a father could buy a mansion in the, a mansion in the suburbs, and it's like now, like, you can't buy anything. And it's like when you look back, you're like talking about like, no, that's not true. Like, the average person was not buying a mansion in the suburbs in the 1990s. And so like, I wonder how you think about this problem of self-perception and whether that's like it's already influenced by someone's zero-sum worldviews.
Yeah, interesting. So I think I maybe would separate your question into the two questions of self-perception and of memory. And I think we do a little bit of work to try to answer both of those. again, I sort of have, I guess, easy answers to both of them in the sense that the self-perception thing, we can check whether using a more objective measure of economic status, like the job that you had or the job that your parents had, sort of an occupational income, the average income of people in that occupation at the time, and mobility measured in that more objective way kind of produces the same patterns as this self-perceived measure, and it does. Your other point about memory, we can do this doesn't exactly answer every part of your question, but we can do things like checking the correlates of like who is actually failing to remember, failing to, not saying that they don't remember, or they don't know where their grandparents grew up, and stuff like that. And we don't find any like neat correlations between demographics or other views.
That would have been so cool.
Yeah, when we so in theory, I think what you're getting at is possible. The sort of selective reporting, shading, your memory of mobility because of other characteristics associated with you. But we don't find evidence of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether you think people change their minds here, because I've been thinking about zero sum, as I mentioned earlier, as kind of a personality trait. And some personality traits do change over time. Like, for instance, if people are like openness to experience or whatever, which can correlate a lot with your openness to immigration policy. And you do see people all the time. There's tons of variation, like even in your own life, like people who when they were younger were very, very different on certain traits, and then like as they got older, maybe they became more conservative, or maybe they became more closed off to the world. And but you are observing these like generational cohorts, which indicates to me a level of stickiness of these beliefs, which kind of makes me a bit doomer about this, because if it's just sort of like your economic experiences when you were a young person are going to carry you through your whole life, and it's like you're not really changing people's minds.
I think I'm sympathetic to your take on this generally. I don't think our study speaks to this directly, right?
Yeah.
So we're not tracking changes in people's zero-sum thinking over time. We're not, importantly, trying to manipulate people's zero-sum worldviews by framing things in particular ways and then seeing how their policy views change in response to that framing. That's not what our study is doing. So I don't have a direct answer. I think your point about thinking about the cohort patterns that we observe is right. And in particular, you could imagine that it's an age pattern. And it's actually just the case that younger people are more zero-sum. And if you had run the same study in 1970, you would have found the exact same thing. Yeah. We don't think that's what's going on because we look at other countries. And we look at, and not our main survey in this paper, but the World Value Survey. We can look at data from other countries, and we can say, 20-year-olds growing up in different countries had different economic experiences of economic growth in their youth compared to 20-year-olds in the U.S., and we find the same patterns there. Yeah. So that's why we think it's not an age thing. It really is sort of a cohort and experiences of growth thing. So all of that to say, I think that you're right in the sense that at least our reading this paper, I think, would not make you particularly optimistic about the prospect of changing zero-sum thinking, because we are looking at these deep-seated like historical forces that operate on very long time horizons. But that's also because that's where our interest was, and that's what we study in this paper. And that's not to say that other people studying different interventions could find ways of changing zero-sum thinking even in the course of a person's life.
I think I also, like, again, very similarly to this question of like how much zero-sum thinking can explain your political views. Even if cohorts as a whole on average maintain their level of zero-sum thinking, that doesn't negate the idea that you could shift even 10% of a cohort shifting in response to, for instance, the President of the United States has made a really full-throated case against trade, against the idea that trade can be anything other than zero-sum, that if you have it is a bad deal if you are manufacturing less than other countries, and that you are exporting you are importing all of these manufactured goods, and it's to me like the idea that have no persuasive impact seems like unlikely.
Yeah, I think that's right. Trade is an interesting example because, again, we ask about these 4 domains, and we ask on a scale of 1 to 5 whether you sort of agree that this particular domain is zero-sum. And trade at the time of our study was the one where we saw the most mass at 3, right? So right in the middle, right? Because I think my guess is people don't really have a strong opinion, or at least back then, did not have a strong opinion either way about whether international trade was zero-sum. And I would imagine that if you ask the same question today, people have developed opinions on this because it has been salient, because of the political discourse from Trump and others. So, yeah, again, I don't think our study speaks to this directly, but I think that your point about people developing views, especially in particular domains, and whether they are zero-sum or not, based on what's going on in the national conversation, seems right.
Yeah. So we saw at the end of the 2024 election, J.D. Vance really started to make an argument about housing and immigration and started to make the case that the reason we were seeing such an insane run-up in home prices that was like really causing a huge political problem for both parties was happening because we saw this influx of immigrants coming across the southwest border. And at some level, like, this is not like an insane view. Like, the idea that there's a large number of new entrants into a market of relatively fixed supply in the short run will lead to higher prices on average. This is obviously, like, from anyone who studies housing, like, knows that this is like not the reason we saw a massive increase in home run in long term. We saw the increase in home prices over the 2020 to 2022 period that we were talking about for most people. But at the same time, I remember at the time being really, really concerned that we had basically manufactured zero-sum situation in a lot of places when we fixed housing supply, even though there's a ton of demand for new housing. And I read this article at the time where I was just like, it's really, really important to reduce as much zero-sum conflict as you can in areas like housing and areas like healthcare, etc., to not create these crises where you are actually going to be in competition with other people over a scarce set of goods. We saw this in Ireland, for instance, where they were like bringing in a very few number of refugees, but because they're really constrained on healthcare resources, it was actually creating problems in their local communities to access hospitals, and wait times were taking a long time. So I guess I want to ask you, and this is like, I know it's not maybe asking you to speak a little bit beyond what your paper says, but I know you've been really entrenched in this literature in general. Like, to me, I think it is the case that if you have areas of this country that are creating a bunch of zero-sum conflict with, really constrained housing supply, you are going to necessarily make people more zero-sum because it becomes rational at some extent. Like, if it is the case that you're trying to find a house and you are looking around and you're like, okay, there's like 2 homes that fit my needs that are available, like, that's going to put you in a state of stress in a way that, like, oh, there's like 20 homes, there's like 30 homes. But, like, if that's true, if I'm right that, like, you could actually make people more positive sum by, like, actually giving housing abundance, making that possible, that would indicate to me that, like, these views are very sticky, they're very not sticky, that they're very fungible based on, like, the economic circumstances of the moment, and they're not really coming down the pipe from, like, 20 years ago. So, like, I don't know, how do you think about this?
Yeah, okay. So there's a lot there. I think a couple of things. One, I think the point about the extent to which we know whether these views are sticky or not is right. And again, that's sort of our previous conversation. I think that that's right. Then we don't know the extent to which these are sticky and whether experiences that happen over the course of a person's adult life can change their zero-something. So I think broadly that point seems right. Housing specifically, I'm not sure. And I think my thinking on this has, I think, changed a little bit. At first, I was like, yeah, it does seem like housing is a domain where zero-sum rhetoric is quite powerful, where the conversation seems to be around, a fixed supply of homes and housing units, and the political implications of thinking that way. I think there is research showing that even when you get people to think about a supply shock in a housing market, they still don't think that would push prices down, right?
This paper you want to talk about it is Folk Economics by friends of the pod, Clayton Null, Chris Elmendorf, and Stan, I always get his name wrong, Aklabji.
Yes, I met him recently at a conference,
but there are 3 great professors. I don't know if you want to talk about this paper a bit.
I'm not an expert on this paper. It's their paper. But I do think that it is relevant to our current conversation about whether zero-sum thinking is the thing in housing policy specifically that is preventing, there's the roadblock or the friction here. It's not clear to me that is exactly, again, right, because even if you tell people that you're going to increase housing supply, they don't think, that's not exactly what's doing it. I do think that they study in that paper zero-sum. They try to measure zero-sum thinking specifically, not using exactly the measure we use, and so maybe it's slightly different for many reasons. But I think that they're also, if I'm reading their paper correctly, not super optimistic about the idea that zero-sum thinking explains the phenomenon that they're studying.
Yeah, no, I mean, their paper was, we had, I was talking to Chris Elmendorf about this paper in particular, and it's called Folk Economics and in Housing, and what they find is that in various domains, when you ask people, do you think, and they're trying to just test, like, do you basically understand supply and demand in a very simple model? Like, if you increase supply of something, what will happen to prices? And like when you ask them about cars, people are generally pretty good at going like, okay, well, there's a lot more cars available, then their prices of cars will go down. And they're able to even extrapolate this like in different markets, like, oh, if like new cars, what happens to used car market, etc. But then when it comes to housing, they're like, absolutely not. New housing does not lower rents. And my explanation for this, as someone who's like been in the space for a while, is largely that like people are observing in their communities that the housing markets are broken. They're like, and they're observing that, and by that I mean they're seeing that there's tons of development happening. Like, I walk around my old suburban neighborhood in Maryland and like it feels very different. Like, I am like shocked by that experience of like coming home and being like, whoa, there's tons of new housing, tons of new commercial development happening here. But the question, of course, is something that's almost unobservable. It's like actually like how much new housing is being developed relative to the demand that's there. And that is something that's very, very hard for someone to experience. And so that would make me think like, obviously, but that like housing would be specific there. But your paper indicates that these views correlate across domains. So I worry about creating these explanations that are so specific to these like housing or whatever.
Yeah, is there something different going on in housing markets than, to your point? I think they also look at like labor markets, like they ask about plumbers and, no, I think that's fair. I don't know. I'm not an expert on housing specifically. I think that it's plausible to me that housing is specific in kind of the ways that you mentioned, that it is unobservable. The forces behind it are unobservable in important ways, that the consequences are important in ways that are different from some other markets. And so I don't think I have a strong take on whether housing markets should be different or not, generally. But yeah, I think so. But I think the point about folk economics is right. I think of zero sum thinking as perhaps a subset of folk economics. So I like that paper.
I've been thinking more about institutional explanations for zero sum or positive sum thinking. And I mean that from like a political standpoint. Have you thought about this question of whether there are certain kinds of political institutions that incentivize zero sum thinking? I mean, when I think about that, like for instance, like open primaries or ranked choice voting or other things, I think there's so many things. Like if you had, if you know that like all you can do is vote between the two candidates that are presented in this after a primary system has gone through, it's like very different than like a ranked choice voting, which I think actually creates kind of a sense of like abundance in that way. Like, but then and why I asked you about this, I know that you looked across different countries, and to me, you would think that the institutional design in different countries would make people more or less open to zero sum thinking. And I don't know if you have intuitions around that.
Yeah, so to the extent we looked across different countries, we basically were looking at whether the basic left-right pattern kind of is reproduced in other countries, and we find that it is. I think that the point broadly about political institutions inculcating a type of zero-sum thinking is something that we don't study directly, but I think is interesting. I think that when we think about domains that are and are not zero-sum in truth, or in, actually zero-sum or not, it strikes me that, politics and electoral competition is a domain that is actually, there is a winner and a loser, I think, in a more clear way than most of the other domains that we've talked about or that we study in the paper. We see a little bit of suggestive stuff here where again, it's the case that strong Democrats are more zero-sum than weak Democrats and sort of down the line, but it kind of reverses a little bit at the end. So the strong Republicans are slightly more zero-sum than the weaker Republicans, which to me is maybe suggested this idea of political interest, or the extent to which you feel involved and attached to the political system and invested in political conflicts, which are zero-sum in nature, can shape your zero-sum thinking. So that's, I guess, kind of where I would go with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've been talking a lot about policies where I have really strong intuitions. I think you share these intuitions at like around trade or immigration, where on average, these things are very positive sum. Like, it is possible for new people to come here, and that it's just like good for everyone, that we're all benefiting from that, or that you have a trade relationship where like you're creating value out of that rather than like trading value away for something else. And so, like, to me, sometimes I'm worried that we're like not talking about like the elephant in the room, which is that like there are certain things that are just definitionally zero sum, like status. Like someone, if you were just ordinarily ranking people based on how much money they have, and we're not talking about like whether, you know, rising tides lift all boats, like there's someone who's number one. There is Forbes is richest person of the year all the time. And even beyond that, the sense of like, oh, like maybe I'm better off when immigrants come here on a income level, but I feel deprioritized by Democratic politicians because they keep talking about immigrants and not talking about me or whatever. So like how much of this is actually about status?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think I have two answers to it. One is to say that absolutely when anthropologists, this guy George Foster, maybe I mentioned before, but when George Foster was studying zero-sum thinking, although he didn't call it that, in sort of rural societies, he was focused on status, among other things, as precisely something that is in limited supply in these types of societies, and that might generate zero-sum conflict. So there's a history of thinking about zero-sum competition for status as opposed to material goods, I suppose, kind of to your point. And the second, I think, perhaps interesting thing that comes out of our paper is that when you look at the education gradient, it generally seems like people with higher levels of education exhibit less zero-sum thinking, except at the very top. And so it seems like people with postgraduate degrees exhibit a little bit more zero-sum thinking. That maybe is kind of related to what you're talking about, where the status associated with going to fancy schools or prestigious, having prestigious degrees, having a lot of education, might be seen as something more zero-sum in fixed supply, and might inculcate this kind of zero-sum thinking. I don't know for sure. It's something that I'm interested in. I think it would be cool to ask not just about level of education, but specific types of educational experiences to try to get at that more directly. But I think that's right. I think. I think that zero-sum thinking over status is certainly something that is going on and would be cool to study more.
And you find in your paper educational differences with zero-sum thinking. So what did you find there? So
it's exactly what I just said, which is that in general, there's this gradient where higher levels of education make you less zero-sum, except it's the highest part of the education distribution, again, measured by education level. So just the amount of education that you've had rather than the specific type.
Did that surprise you, or were you like, that tracks for my Harvard?
I think it's a little bit easy for me to rationalize this, and for us, I think as academics, to be like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. It seems like PhD slots and academic jobs are in short supply. I think that's one pattern where I think I'd want to just like do a little bit more of investigating exactly what is going on there before like telling you for sure that that's a real thing.
Yeah.
But it's plausible.
Yeah. I'm actually hoping you can tell me more about George Foster's work, because he's actually how you start out your paper, is talking about him. And he's an anthropologist, which is very different than what you do.
Yeah. So again, I think that's sort of the starting point in this literature. And I think one of my co-authors on this paper, Nathan Nunn, really, I think, takes the ideas of George Foster and cultural anthropology seriously and runs with it in other developing country contexts, and studies the extent to which his ideas around what he calls like the image of limited good. Again, this idea of good being not just material rewards, but also things like status, to your earlier question. To what extent that can explain things like demotivating beliefs, things like witchcraft theories, right? The idea that if someone is gaining, then they're doing something nefarious, basically.
I want a Salem witch trial study.
Yeah, no, and we don't. Yeah, he hasn't, to my knowledge, and we haven't studied this in the U.S. context, witchcraft specifically. But and so he kind of pushes, I think, in that direction where it takes the ideas of George Foster quite seriously. It looks at them in other developing country contexts in the current moment. And then our study is, I think, saying, okay, can we take these ideas that originally were conceived to apply to, I guess, smaller scale pre-industrial societies and examine the extent to which they explain both political and policy issues in the modern U.S. in a very different context.
Yeah.
And so I think it's kind of cool that it kind of works, or that a lot of these predictions kind of hold up in a very different context than I think what Foster had in mind.
Yeah. And, I guess I would ask you this. I mean, like, to me, I wondered if your experience in academia had been part of what pushed you to study this. Like, do you remember, like, what kind of made you interested in zero-sum?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have a less interesting answer to this question than perhaps you would have imagined, which is that I think my interest from this is kind of just combining a couple of different, like, substantive and methodological interests in U.S. politics and these historical forces that that shape politics today. I have other work that I think we've talked about maybe before about World War I and its effects on the civil rights movement. And so again, this idea of taking seriously these really large-scale historical forces and their implications for politics then and now. And then also an interest in survey methodology, which actually isn't as common in economics. And so I kind of wanted to run a big survey, and that's also part of the reason I was interested in this project.
And I had you on my old show, Good on Paper, at the Atlantic, talking about this World War I paper, and I think there's often a split within the folks I talk to in academia on politics. I don't want to say it's like the split in academia, it's like who I talk to, where like a lot of them are either focused on like kind of like long run structural things where you're thinking about like the impact of something that happened like even sometimes like a century ago on like how people think about the world today versus people today who are like really maybe they're much more interested like as maybe almost a practitioner where they're like, okay, how do I persuade people right now to shift their opinions on issues? And like, I wonder if you could help synthesize this for me, because I think that like sometimes people hear these conversations and they're like, wait, but like we know persuasion is possible. Jerusalem, you just had a podcast about political persuasion at the time. So like, how are both these things true?
I mean, I think my simple answer is they both have to be true because people's views are shaped by a lot of stuff. They're shaped by their current experiences and their experiences in, the current moment. They're shaped by their own childhood experiences, and they're shaped intergenerationally by their ancestors' experiences. And so I don't have like a coherent, I think, answer to this question or a coherent take on this. I will say that it's something that I think about a lot in my work, where like I have a couple of projects about the 1920s and World War I, and I have a couple of projects looking at the modern U.S. and the modern workplace. Then I have projects that are somewhere in between, thinking about intergenerational transmission of political behavior and the extent to which where you grow up shapes your political views. And so slowly I'm trying to like kind of approaching this from both directions. But that's sort of the most, I think, coherent answer I have to this, which is that political behavior and policy views are shaped by all sorts of stuff. All sorts of it, all of this has to matter. They're linked by precisely this intergenerational mechanism that I find particularly interesting.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I started to think through here around this is when people hear, oh, if you have a family history of enslavement, it means your views are like X now. They often think it's like genetic. Yeah. They think it's being like, or even heritability in general. People often think heritability has to be genetic when it doesn't. Like, if your parents went to college, you're more likely to go to college. That can be because of some heritable thing, some genetic thing. But it can also be like, when you're young, your parents tell you a lot that college is important, and you become convinced of this through arguments. And so if you have a family history of enslavement, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's some sort of like, genetic component to like what's happened there. Though I know there's like epigenetic research, of course. I don't want to like say there's nothing to that. But I do think that from my perspective, when I hear that, what I'm largely imagining is happening is that you are being given explanations about how the world works from your parents, from your grandparents, etc., that you are being convinced of. And if that's actually a persuasion mechanism. So for you, like, how when you think about it, like, where do you kind of...
Yeah, that's an interesting way of characterizing it. And I think that's right. I think that's the way I think about it as well. And I think that, individual studies can say more or less about the exact mechanism through which a particular trait or a particular political viewpoint or characteristic is transmitted. Honestly, our study is taking a pretty high-level approach to this and saying that we can't determine exactly why there's this transmission between parents and grandparents and kids, but it certainly seems to be there. Persuasion, or just the stories you hear, to your point, as a kid, could be part of it. I think about also parents and kids tend to live in the same place or live in similar parts of the country if you don't move away. And maybe it's actually just the influence of the shared environment, right? That could also be partly what's going on.
Yeah, it's just imagine just having bad air quality in your area. That could be.
Tall buildings make you more Democrat, right? Yeah. And that could be a plausible mechanism for why parents and kids partisanship tend to be correlated. I don't think that's actually what's going on, but again, specific studies can say more or less about that kind of question.
To me, I was kind of just I don't know very much about my grandfather in Dixa, Eritrea growing up. But I've never been there, and I don't know what that life is like. But my father has imbued this sense in me that wow, you can really make it in the world. You can go from that to Asmara, Eritrea to the United States, and life can be really good. And I didn't observe that. I was 3 years old when we came here. So to me, these stories often feel very powerful. And when you think about why in your research, you see this impact of like immigration, positive sum, exposure to immigration makes you more likely to be positive sum. To me, that's like, oh, you are like literally like hearing these stories all the time, even if you personally are not witnessing that like intergenerational mobility. Like that just makes you feel like the world shifts a lot. You know?
And I think that our story and our paper is consistent with exactly that mechanism, right? It's like, why are second generation immigrants less zero sum than people their age and and who share very similar characteristics but who aren't immigrants? I think that's kind of what the story that you just outlined is probably what I have in mind too. Is our data consistent with other stories? Probably, but yeah, I think broadly, I think that sort of stories that you hear from your parents kind of thing is I think a lot of what is going on here.
Well, Sahil, this is always our last and final question. What is a take you've come across recently that really, really ticks you off? And it can be anything. People bring up books that they've read recently, tweets that they've seen, parenting advice they've been given, relationship advice that they've been given. But what's something that you've just like, this was bad, this annoyed me?
Oh, interesting. I will say that I think, okay, this is like a very specific thing that has been annoying me lately, but nobody understands how the quiet car works. On the Amtrak.
Okay, so what is the quiet car?
The quiet car. Sorry. Okay, so I've been taking the Amtrak a lot lately, and the quiet car is the one car on the train that you're not supposed to talk in. It's supposed to be, quote, a library-like atmosphere. And regularly, I have been getting on there, and people have been on their phones. They've been having conversations. They've been playing music sometimes. And I've been like, what part of like library-like atmosphere is so difficult to understand? No, of course not. Like,
okay,
I'm not gonna...
I'll be honest. Okay, I have become a little bit insane about this because and I'm not gonna like yell at people or whatever, but I find that if you just like ask people to like stop, they often will just not.
That
like,
terrifies me. I'm definitely not.
I was on a plane and this like 11-year-old kid before takeoff is like blasting whatever his game is, and his mom is doing nothing about it. And I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna say something. So I was like, hey, like, do you mind putting headphones in? And she's like, oh yeah, sure. And then he just like did. And then the people around me looked like they were like, wow, like you can just do things. I would like to encourage you to say something, because on the quiet car, I've had like very good conductors that will just like tell people to stop.
Yeah, I don't want them to be mean about it, you know.
But it's not like, it's not. It's just like sometimes I wonder, like, people, do they just not realize that like people are annoyed?
Yeah. I should give them the benefit of the doubt. Yeah,
no,
I
mean, I do think some of them are just rude.
Okay.
But I feel like norm breakdown, we all have to be a part of.
Norm breakdown. Yeah.
Be the change you wish to see in the world.
A little more Japan.
You would be so happy if someone was like, hey, can you put your headphones in?
Oh, I would. Yeah, but I'm never gonna do it.
You're never. Like, sounds like this is not happening.
Absolutely not.
Not taking this advice.
No.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, so much fun. Thanks.
The Arguments production team includes Ranjini Chakraborty, Isabella Pereira, Angela Tracy, Kate Crawford, and Eli Richmond. Our theme music is by Breakmaster Cylinder. If you want to hear more from The Argument, you can become a subscriber at theargumentmag.com.